Oh, hey. So in the last video, what we did was we built a Python application in just 20 lines of code that allowed us to scrape MLB.com and return us back a list of players. Now, I want to take that one step further and actually build a full-fledged web application that allows us to go to a URL and click on a team and have it return the rosters for us visually, instead of running a Python application in our terminal. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is building out a front end and a back end. The front end is what we use to interact, right? So if you've ever written a tweet, clicked on a video on YouTube, checked out of an e-commerce shop, that's all front end behavior. Back end is really what's used to communicate with databases, communicate with the server. So if you've ever authenticated yourself or logged in via Google or anything like that to any website, that is really back end logic happening. So that allows you to authenticate, know it's you that logged in and not me, right? And that's just an example. But what we're going to be doing is actually building out an API in Python to communicate with what we built in the last video. The front end is going to be written in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. These are like three core web technologies that power the web, right? And we're going to be using what's called React, which is a JavaScript framework. Don't get too overwhelmed by it. You're going to get the rundown. So this might all just be gibberish and you might already be tuned out. But let me show you a visual representation of what we're going to build and let's get started. Before we just start writing a bunch of random code, we should get an idea of what we're actually building. So you can see here that I have a front end and an API. The front end is going to be written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can see this is the React.js logo, which is just a JavaScript framework. You might not even know what that means. Doesn't matter. All you need to know is that this is going to be what we interact with. We're going to have a drop-down menu, and when you click on the drop-down menu, it's going to have all the MLB teams, and we're going to be able to select a team, right? And then we have what's called our API. And an API, you can really view, it stands for Application Programming Interface, if you really care. But essentially what it allows us to do is reach a URL or make a request to a URL and then return us something. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to select Red Sox, as an example, from our dropdown. It's going to then make a request to the API endpoint dash roster. And then this dash roster endpoint is going to scrape the Red Sox roster from MLB.com, and then it's going to return it back to the API, which then returns it back to our front end so we can see everyone on the Red Sox. Now, this could be dynamic. So when we say, now we select the Cubs, it's going to say get roster, web scrape the Cubs roster, and then return it to our front end so we can visualize and see the roster, right? Ultimately, pretty straightforward. This isn't crazy complex, but that doesn't mean that it's not hard to implement and get everything working right. So now let's talk about project installation. So what we're going to do now is install Python and Node, which is what we need for React. So first thing we're going to do, go to python.com or python.org and click on downloads and select the latest release. So you can click on latest Python 3 release, Python 3.12.3. The other option is you can install Homebrew on your machine. So if you run this command, go into your terminal and run that, you'll be able to use Homebrew. And then you can install Python via Homebrew if you want to do that. So really your two options here are to install Homebrew and run brew Python, or just install it directly from the python.org release and download it. Next, we need to install Node.js. So what we're going to be doing here is going to node.js.org, download Node.js version 20.12.2. At this point, it's May 5th, 2024. So this could be different by the time you're watching this. But ultimately, you can do that there. Or you can use Homebrew again. So if you install Homebrew from the Python portion, now you can use it to install Node. You just run brew install Node. And then this will allow you to run something called npm install. And what npm is a package manager for Node. So what you can do is run npm install and install a bunch of packages just like we do in Python or any other language. So you can run npm I npx, which is what we're going to need to create a React application. So it's important that we just get those things out of the way. So once you do that, how do you verify that all of this is actually installed? So what you can do is run which Python. You can see that we'll get our path for Python 3. Now, if we run npm version, you're going to see that we get a bunch of information on all of our npms. I think if you actually run node-v, you'll get your Node version. This is how you know everything is up and running. So now we can move on to actually creating our project structure and start to install things. All right, so let's take it from the top. In our terminal, we're going to get into a directory of our choosing. In this case, I'm in the code directory. If I run pwd, you can see it's users, Sean Pitts, code. And I'm going to create a new directory here called roster_app. Now I'm going to cd into my roster app, and I'm going to create 2 different directories, one for our front end, one for our back end. So mkdir frontend, mkdir backend. Awesome. So now that I have these, we need to differentiate what these 2 are going to be, right? So front end is going to be our JavaScript or React, and our backend is going to be our Python application. So let's start with the backend. So let's cd into our backend, cd backend, and now we need to create our virtual environment that allows us to isolate our Python packages and dependencies to this specific backend folder. So what we're going to do is we're going to say python3-m venv venv. It's going to create a virtual environment. It's going to take a moment, but once this is done, we can run ls, and then to get into our virtual environment or activate it, we do source venv bin activate. And then you'll see that this will get appended on the left-hand side. So then what we want to do is we want to start installing our packages that we need for our backend API. So what we're going to be doing is building this in Flask. Flask is a very minimal Python framework. It's a web application framework. So let's say you see that here in the minimal application, it says from Flask import Flask. This is what we're going to have to do. But let's run pip install Flask. You'll see now that when we run pip list, that we get a bunch of different packages that are installed along with Flask. So now we could actually install that into our application. The next thing we're going to need is pip install requests. This is going to allow us to make an API request, and then we're also going to have to install beautiful soup 4, which will allow us to do the web scraping. And then that is all. So now that we have those 3 packages, beautiful soup, requests, and Flask, we can now start creating our API. So as I mentioned, an API stands for Application Programming Interface. So let's open our backend here. Cool. Backend. And then we're going to go into the terminal again and create a new file. So then let's do touch app.py. In our backend, you'll see that we now have an app.py file, and we can start writing some Python code. Now, as I mentioned, this is really going to be the snippet we need. So if you go to flask.com and then you go on a minimal application, you'll see that we have this snippet of code we can run. So you see here that says from Flask import the Flask library. And then we're declaring what's called an app in Flask, which is a variable instantiating the class of Flask. And then we're saying add app.route, meaning the root of the website. We're going to run this function def hello world and return HTML, which says hello world. Now, how do we actually see this in the real world? So if you go into your terminal again, and then we run Flask, run -p, and then 8080, which is a port on your browser, you'll see here that we get a localhost browser that we can run. So you can take this URL, open Google Chrome, open a new tab, and then run it. And you can see we get hello world back. So if we go back to the code, we're essentially going to the / endpoint, which is the root, right? So this is essentially the backslash. And then it's returning this P, hello world. Now, if I want to update this to maybe H1 tags, which makes it bigger, we can go and stop this and then run Flask run again, go back to our app, refresh, and now you can see it's bigger. So we have a basic Flask application or a basic API. It just doesn't really do anything, and it doesn't solve what we want, right? So now what we need to do is install a few other packages along with it. So let's import the request library that we installed. And then on top of that, let's say from BS4, import beautiful soup. And this is going to allow us to do the web scraping. Now, as I mentioned, we don't really want, this is great and all, but this isn't really going to be useful to us. So we need to create a new route. And what I mean by that is when we do app.route, like we did above, and then we say roster, and then we declare a variable that we're going to pass through. So let's do bracket or less than team greater than. What will happen now when we do this is we'll say def get roster, and then we'll pass a parameter called team, and then we'll just print out the team, right? So, or we can even do one better. Let's return HTML. So we'll say h1, and then we'll need an f string, team. And an f string allows us to pass in a variable. So what now is going to happen when we restart our Flask server is you're going to see that we have this roster team. So let's look at the behavior here. So if I go to roster, you're going to see that there's no URL found, and that's because we didn't define an endpoint for it. But what if I pass Red Sox? Look, it renders Red Sox. Why do you think that is? Because we did \roster \Red Sox. The Red Sox is the team variable that's being passed through, which is then running this function, get roster team, which is a parameter, and then it's outputting or returning that team. So all this is doing is really rendering what we passed through in the URL. Not that cool, right? But at least it's the building blocks of what we're going to be doing, which is then scraping the roster. So now let's start writing in this function or building out our web scraping. So for the sake of time and the fact that I don't want to rewrite all this code, which I did in the last video, so you can go check it out there, I'm going to copy and paste what we did in that video. So let's go and paste this. And now we should see that this works, right? So if we want to instead return an f string here that actually does h1 team roster, and then we'll go h1. So you'll see now that when we restart this and go to Red Sox, look at that. We get all of the players. How do you think we did that? So if we go back to the code, you'll see that we defined Beautiful Soup. We then found a bunch of HTML in that, more or less. We created an array. The array is empty at the moment. So then we said, give us the team, and then loop over the 40-man roster, which is the MLB.com 40-man roster table here. And this is all HTML. If you didn't watch the last video. Then in there, what we did was we said, give us the player, the individual player, and append it to this roster array or a list. And then what we said is at the end of it all, after you loop through all the players and appended them to that empty list, then output it into an h1 tag in HTML, and voila, that's what we get. So that's cool, but how do we actually make this interactive? How do we have a drop-down menu that allows us to select the team and have this dynamically update and make it all pretty? That is the front end. So let's briefly talk about our front end. Now, the front end is really where things start to get pretty and where we start to make interactable components on our web page so that you can choose a team from the drop-down menu, such as the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Cubs, or whatever it may be, and get the roster, right? We want to display that on the web page. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to open up our front-end directory in our terminal. So if we go into the project directory and do cd front-end, you're going to see that we have nothing here. Now, the first thing we're going to do is actually create our React app. Now, React is essentially an open sourced, and open source really just means available generally for free use or free consumption. So what we're going to be doing here is using React, and it was built by Facebook. And React is a framework that allows us to build user interfaces or websites. So let's create a React app. So in our front end, we're going to run npx create React app. Now this is going to take a few minutes, so just be patient as React gets installing. Okay, so now that React is installed and our project is created, we can clear our console and run ls. You're going to see that we have a project called app, and we can cd into this. When we run ls again, you're going to see that we have a bunch of different folders and directories under our front-end app. And in Visual Studio Code, we can see this as well. Now let's just run our React application to see what this looks like by running npm start. And this is going to kick off a process which opens a web browser, and it's going to be localhost 3000 by default. So you're going to see now that we get edit src app.js and save to reload, or you can click the link to learn React. So how is this all being generated and what's going on behind the scenes? So if we open Visual Studio Code, you're going to see that there is a node modules, public, src, package.json, and readme. And this can get pretty confusing because if you've never seen this before, you've never seen these file structures or file extensions, you probably don't know what it is. But let's just look at the package.json. Now, package.json is super important for React apps and a lot of JavaScript frameworks in general because it really stores our dependencies. Now, dependencies are essentially packages that we can use in our application, such as a package to make an API request, right? Or something we've done in Python, which was like installing Beautiful Soup to web scrape, right? Very similar concept. NPM is the package manager for JavaScript. So you can see that we have our dependencies object here, and then we also have our scripts. Now the scripts is going to be referenced when we ran npm start, right? So npm start kicks off the start command, which says use the React scripts start command. So essentially we're running a command to run a command. And we do this through the React scripts dependency or module package, whatever you want to call it. And what this does is it kicks off a script that opens the web browser and gives us live updates as we make changes to our code. Now, the node modules is where we can reference all of our packages or our dependencies. So you can see that React kind of gives you everything you can possibly install, running from A to Z. So this is going to be pretty heavy, but we're never really going to touch our node modules. Next is the public folder, and our public is going to contain a lot of our assets that we use, such as like images, CSS style sheets, whatever it may be. In terms of like things you'd render, such as images, they usually go in public. And then the SRC is really where we want to spend the bulk of our time. Now, the most important file to look at right now is the index.js. And you can kind of view index.js as our root. So imagine you just have a blank web page, almost like a blank white sheet of paper. You need somewhere to start, right? And you need somewhere to start putting stuff on the paper. So the root is kind of like that, right? And that's our index.js. And React allows us to dynamically render out HTML. So when you see things like these tags here, React.strict_mode or app, what this is doing is it's actually rendering a component. Now, a component is something you'll hear time and time again in React. And component is really just a dynamic way of pushing out HTML to your website or your blank canvas, you can say, right? So if we look at this app component, what is it actually doing? Well, what this is doing is being imported from, it says import app from app. And what this path here is doing is referencing app.js. Now, app.js is another component, right? So we see this is rendered in on line 10. And in here, we have a function that returns a bunch of HTML code. Now, if we go into our website and do Command Option J, we're going to see that our console is opened. And if we go over into Elements, and then we click on, let's say, this block here, you'll see that we have our header, our image, our p tag, our class. And if we go into our Visual Studio Code editor, you can see this is more or less exactly what we have in the web page. So if we delete this and save it, now you're going to see we have a blank canvas. That's because we're not rendering any HTML. So let's do h1 and let's just say hello world. We'll save this and you'll see now that we get hello world printed into our blank sheet of paper. So what we're doing now is we're using index.js as the root. It's rendering the component of app, and app is rendering more HTML. So it's a little bit of an abstraction layer, but it essentially allows us to dynamically render HTML, more or less. And it's actually called JSX, but nonetheless, the next thing we're going to want to do is start to build our scaffolding for what we want to build, which is to have a drop-down menu that selects a team and then makes a request to our API and gives us back a roster. So how do we do that? Well, if we go into Google and we look up React Semantic UI, you're going to see that this is actually a React dependency or package we can install to use. So why would we want to use something like Semantic UI React? Well, we could write the HTML dropdown ourselves, right? If I look up HTML dropdown menu, we can absolutely create this, and we would have to know HTML and CSS, which can make our life a little bit more difficult, and it's just more things we have to learn, and we have to know CSS really well to be able to build like a really good drop-down menu. Semantic UI kind of abstracts that out, so we don't have to do that. So what we're going to do is click on the Get Started tab, and we're going to install the Semantic UI React package and Semantic UI CSS. So let's go into our front end, and we'll open up a new tab. So now that we're in our front end, let's just run npm install Semantic UI React Semantic UI CSS. This will install, and then we're going to have to import our Semantic UI CSS into our app.js file, and you'll see why we have to do that. So we're going to go into our app.js, and we're going to drop this in on line 2. It could be after this if you wanted it to, but I'm just going to choose to put it up here. So now that we have everything installed, we need to build out our drop-down menu. And what we can do is go into the left-hand side under modules, look for drop-down. Now let's just look at a very basic drop-down menu here. And you're going to see that this is actually quite complex when you first look at it. It's really not, but you see this const variable that's defining an array of objects and what does this all do and how does it render. But the most important thing to draw your eyes to is right down here, lines 44 through 49. This is going to be the structure of our drop-down menu. Now we have to actually use this somehow. So if we go into here and let's say we copy this code from here and drop it in, you're going to see that we will get, let's just tab this in. You're going to see that we get an error. Dropdown is not defined. Friend options is not defined. That's because we don't have our dropdown component being imported. So what we need to do is go back into Semantic UI React and grab this import command. This import command gives us this component to be able to be used. So now when we drop this in, and now you can see we have this big, long drop-down menu, but there's no options inside of it for us to click. So let's change our placeholder to be select team. And you can see this updates here. Now we need to define our options. So we need to have a few different options, right? And we want these to be our MLB teams. So what we're going to do is we're going to, outside of our app function, we're going to create a const variable, and this is going to be called teams. Teams is going to be an array of objects, and we're going to write the text will be Boston Red Sox, and our value is going to be called Red Sox. We'll create one more, and our text is going to be New York Yankees, and our value will be Yankees. So let's refresh this, and you're going to see we still have nothing. But if we go into our dropdown and pass through options equals teams, now you're going to see we have two options, the Red Sox and the Yankees. So pretty cool, right? Now we at least have something being rendered, but there's no behavior. What we wanted to do is we wanted to build a flow that allows us to choose a team and it'll make an API request. So let's create a button now. And how do we do that? We'll go into Semantic UI React, scroll all the way up, and under Elements, we have a button. And we just want a basic button, right? We don't want anything fancy. So we're going to go import button from Semantic UI React. We're going to drop that in right below our button. Now I'm going to show you guys what we're going to run into here. So you can see our button didn't render, and that's because we just imported it. But if we run button, and then we say click me, for example, you're going to see that we do get this button, but this isn't really efficient, right? Because we have two imported packages from the same dependency. So what we can do instead is just do dropdown, comma, button to make this a little bit more efficient. And save lines, of course. We don't want to make more lines of code. So now our button's going to say click me, or we can say something more related to our app, such as get roster. Now the get roster button is going to essentially make the API request for us, but we need to be able to handle what's called state. Now you can view state as something that's dynamically changing, right? So just like your mood is a current state, like what is the state of your well-being? I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad. React works in a very similar fashion. We need to manage state somehow. So if I change Red Sox to Yankees, I want the state to be updated to Yankees. Meaning if I click get roster for the Yankees, I don't want it to get the Red Sox, which I previously was on, right? So as our UI dynamically changes, we also need our state to be changed. So how do we do that? Well, React uses something called use state. And how we do this is we say import React, and then we say comma, curly brackets, use state from React. Now, nothing's going to happen, but let's start changing our state. So how do we do this? Well, in our dropdown, right, which is where we're changing the team and where we want to manage state, we're going to say on change, which is an event handler saying on change of something in our dropdown menu, run this function, and it's going to be called handle change. Now we're going to see that there's no handle change defined, which is causing our error. So we have to create this function. So in our function app, let's say const handle change, and then we're going to pass an arrow function, which is just another way to define a function. And then we're going to say console.log changed. So now if we open our console by running Command Option J, and we clear this out. Now, if I change it, you're going to see I get changed. Change it again, changed times 2. But this doesn't tell us our value. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass 2 parameters into our handle change event. It's going to be event in data. So let's actually output my data when I change the team. Now the Red Sox you're going to see is an object that gets passed through. And there's a value that also gets placed on this. So where does the value come from? Well, our values is coming from this property in our array or in our array of objects. So now we can actually say, give us the data.value, and this is how you reference something in an object. So when we clear this out and we choose Yankees, you now see we get Yankees, which is cool. So what do we do now? Well, we want to make an API request to our Flask application. So how do we do that? Well, we need our button to be able to handle that request. So we're going to say button on click, which is another event handler in JavaScript. We're going to say fetch roster. And now we're going to get a fetch roster is not defined. So let's define a new function called fetch roster equals, and we're going to not have any parameters in our arrow function here. And we're just going to say log fetch to make sure this works. So when we change it and then click get roster, we see fetch is outputted into our console. So this is very visual, right? Now, what do we need to import to be able to make this request? Well, there is something in React called fetch in JavaScript that you can use, but I'm going to use a library called Axios to show you how dependencies work in package.json. So if I open up my terminal again and I run npm install Axios, and then this will get thrown into our package.json for our application. So I just did it at the wrong level. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to import my Axios library. So on the next line, I'm going to say import Axios from Axios. So I'm saying import the Axios function from the Axios dependency. So in my fetch roster, what I'm going to want to do is make a Axios request to our API. Now, one thing we have to note is if we look at Axios' documentation, you're going to see that it gives us an npm install like we ran, and then let's look at example. So you're going to see that we have this kind of async function, and async's important in Axios because essentially what async does, and I'm probably going to butcher this, so let's just say explain async to me like a newbie, right? Because if I really understood it as well as I did, then I should be able to explain it to you. But it says, imagine you're at a restaurant and you want to order some food. You tell the waiter your order, and then you wait for your food to be cooked and brought to your table. This is like synchronous programming. It goes line by line, right? Code usually goes line by line. Now, if you're running something asynchronously, you can kind of look at it as a buffet where there are different food stations. You can go to the salad bar, the main course station, the dessert table, without waiting for one to finish before going on to the next. And that's kind of the same way as asynchronous programming, right? Where you can kind of run different functions simultaneously and you don't have to wait on one line to move on to the next. Probably could have explained it that way. So what we need to do in our fetch roster is run an async function. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, go ahead and define our URL. Now our URL is going to be a formatted string, just like in Python where you do the F. Instead, we're going to use backticks, and we're going to say HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8080 roster $variable team. Now, what does this do? Well, it says team is not defined. But if you remember in our handle change, we said we wanted to manage state, but we're not doing that. We're not managing the state. All we did was console.log that out, but we need to be able to update our state. So we're going to create two variables, which is from our useState function, and we're going to say const, and then we're going to pass a variable, and it's going to be team in an array, and then it's going to say setTeam equals useState 0. So now, when we handle this change and we get a new team, we want to say set the team to be our data.value. So like we got with the data object and we had Red Sox as the value, we want to now set the team, which is running a function to update this state variable, which is team. So essentially, we're going to use that as our state tracker. Now, in our URL and our fetch roster and our async function, it's going to say get the URL, but then also append our team, which is our state, depending on what's changed. But what is this URL? Well, if you remember from our backend API, we passed this Yankees or Red Sox, and then you can see we get the roster. And that's what we want, but we want that returned not from a Python script, but in our UI. So now what we need to do is we're going to say const response equals await Axios.get URL. And why we do this await command is because we want to wait until Axios makes that request to the URL before defining this response variable. If we don't wait, it's possible that the asynchronous function hasn't completed yet and we don't get anything back. So that could be kind of detrimental to our app. Now, let's console.log the response. And you're going to see how this works in real time. So when we select our team, and let's clear out the console to be fresh, you're going to see we get a network error. Why do we get a network error? Well, what we need to do is we need to implement what's called cores. Now, cores, I'm also going to do a terrible job defining. So let me go cores in Flask. Let's go cores Flask. You're going to see that Flask cores is actually a package. And this allows us to make localhost requests. So 127.0.0.18080, this is actually a localhost request. So we need to go into our backend, and we need to actually run Control-C and shut this down for a minute. So now let's go into our backend, and we'll go into backend, app.py, and then what we're going to do from here is we're going to say from Flask cores, import cores cross origin. Now this will allow us from our front end to make a request to our backend API from localhost to localhost. So how do we define or allow this? We have to say cores equals cores app, and then we have to say app.config cores headers equals content type. And this is a header that's being passed through. So now when we go to run Flask run P, you're going to see that no module named Flask core. So we need to do is we need to run pip install Flask cores. So now that that's successfully installed, we can run Flask run, and now everything should be up and running again. So let's make that request one more time, and let's see what happens. Well, if we refresh the app, and we do Yankees and get roster, you're going to see we get something back now. So it likes that we're talking localhost to localhost. If you also wanted to change 127.0.0.1 to localhost 8080, you could do that as well. So they're kind of used synonymously in this case. But you can see our data here is returning an H1 tag with a bunch of information. So what we can do here is we can go back into our app.js and we can actually say return, or we don't actually want to say return. We want to update state again. So what we need to do is we need to define a new state, which is roster and set roster. This is going to say use state is 0. So now once we get this response back, we're going to say set roster to response dot data. So now what we can do is we can make a H1 tag that says give us the roster. So now you can see we get 0, but watch what happens when I click Yankees. Look at that. Now we get an H1 tag. But weird, because that isn't working, right? Why is it giving me the HTML and array? I don't want all that. Well, if we look back at our app.py, you can see that we're actually returning HTML in our Python, and that's not really what we want to do. What we actually want to do is just return our team roster. So we're going to restart our Python server with that update and refresh this. Choose Red Sox, and now you can see that we get everything. Now to wrap things up, how do we output our rosters in a clean format? Well, what we did was, if we look here, we threw them into a table, which looks very clean. So now if I choose Red Sox, you're going to see this roster now updates and gives me all the Red Sox players. So what I did was I went into Semantic UI React. I took all of the components that I need for my table, which is just another collection in Semantic UI React. I imported these, right, and we can see them all here. And then what I did was I created this logic. Now, this is the logic you're looking at here. So let's walk through what this is. Well, I'm saying if the roster variable is present, right, if there is a roster indeed, then print out a table. And we're going to have one header cell, which is name, and we can see that here. And then we're going to define a body, and in that we're going to have rows. Now, in our rows, what we really need is all of our players. So we want a row per player. So what we did was we mapped over our roster, and specifically the data object inside of roster, which is the state we set once we fetch the roster through Axios, right, and update the state. So we're going to loop over that. There's going to be two parameters, an item and an index. The item is going to represent each individual player, and the index is going to keep track of what place we're at in that list. So if I have a list of 40 players, my first player is actually going to be the 0 index. My second player is going to be the 1 index. My third player is going to be the second index. So we're essentially defining a key here, which is saying keep iterating, and for the length of this roster data array, make a key and have that be a record of the index, and then output the item according to that index. So we're getting the 0 player, the 1 player, the second player, the third player, and that's how we are iterating over this. And we're creating a table row and a table cell for each of these. So we're creating a row, and then a cell, which is the player itself. But we added one more piece of logic that was super crucial. Now, what we did below or above in the fetch roster function was we said if the team does not equal 0. So what we have here is use state is 0 by default. So if we don't even select a team, it's going to be 0. But the problem is if we send an API request with the team as 0, there's no MLB team called 0. So we're going to get an error and it's not going to output and it's not going to map over it. So we need to be able to handle that logic or that edge case. So we're saying if the team is not equal to 0, then try to make the URL request. Then we can actually get rid of these console log statements to clean things up. We're going to get the response back from Axios, and then we're going to set the roster to be our response object. Inside of that, obviously, is data, which is all of our players. And that's why we're mapping over roster data. So we're going to say then if there is an error, let's add another state, which is the error variable. And we're going to set our error to be the error that's thrown if it fails to capture that team or that roster, right? And then what we're doing in our logic to actually render out the HTML, we're saying if there's a roster, output our table as we expect. But if it isn't, and there's an error, which is our state variable when there's an error, just output that there's an error. And then give us the JSON object instead of throwing like some gross error screen at us. And then if neither of those are true, then just say it's loading. So if I refresh this, for example, you're going to see that we get a loading. And that's because we haven't chose a roster yet. So once we do choose a roster and get the roster, now we're going to get our table. And this is going to take a moment. So ultimately, what we've done is we've created a full-fledged web application that uses an API to web scrape data using Python. We then built a front-end UI using React. And now we've merged those two programming languages and those two frameworks and built something really feasible. Now you can take the skills you learned here and run with them and build your own idea. And that's kind of my goal. I really want you guys to be able to take this information you might have gotten from this video and just run with it and build what you want. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you love this video, please like and subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Take it easy.